Hello and welcome. This is the second episode of the Vijñapti podcast. I'm joined here tonight by my friend and previous guest, Nick Bright from Bright on Buddhism. Nick, good to have you back.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for having me back. I had such a good time last time, and I can't wait to get into it for what we're going to discuss this time.
Awesome. All right, let's just jump right in. So, this is a good episode because we're discussing a book that's very important to me and kind of my thinking and my website. But you obviously have a lot more technical knowledge at this point when it comes to Buddhism. And the book we're reviewing today is called Why I Am Not a Buddhist by Thompson. And just to give a little bit of background for the book, Thompson is a scholar who focuses mainly on problems of cognition, problems of consciousness from more of a psychological lens, but he has a very unique approach to it, and in his own work focuses a lot more on phenomenology as kind of the primary lens that he uses to go about exploring cognition and consciousness and perception. But he actually has a decent background in religious studies, and specifically in Buddhism. Now, to give you my own background, Nick, and I'm curious to hear yours as well. When I first saw the book on the shelf, I thought to myself, well, this is going to be a really shitty book. And I begrudgingly picked it up off the shelf and threw it in my basket, and that was that, and I started reading it. And I figured it was going to be this, extremely unnecessarily polemic against, Buddhism by this guy who had a grudge for whatever reason. But then I kept reading, and I'm like, this guy actually knows a lot about Buddhism, and the stuff that he's saying, while, we'll get into it, today and in future episodes, I don't agree with all of it. Based on what I see as the facts, and I don't agree with all of it. But he has a lot of good points that he's making, especially with his primary thesis of Buddhist exceptionalism. So Nick, I was curious if you could let us know what your interpretation of the thesis is. If you could just kind of give a brief rundown of that, and then what you make of it, what you make of Thompson's perspective on this thing we're calling Buddhist exceptionalism.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. So, just for context, this whole book is around 250 pages long, and we're going to be breaking it up chapter by chapter and discussing each chapter through different episodes. And so today is going to be the introduction and chapter 1, where he goes really deep into this issue of what he calls the myth of Buddhist exceptionalism. And so his thesis for the whole book could be broadly interpreted to say, here are all the sort of problems I have with Buddhism as it is presented in academic and non-academic contexts today. He doesn't have a problem with Buddhists, and he especially doesn't have a problem with Buddhism at large in history, or especially in history in Asia. What he has a problem with contributes to this issue of exceptionalism that we'll get into, which is essentially these misrepresentations, these misunderstandings, and these sort of false equivalencies being drawn between Buddhism and things like science and cognition, neuroscience, in the modern era, primarily by Westerners. And so this myth of Buddhist exceptionalism is an issue that he is arguing that comes about because people who are responding to a very recent historical outlier known as Protestant Christianity are looking at Buddhism and they're saying, hey, this doesn't have an all-knowing, all-powerful, omnipresent creator deity that you have to answer to. They're saying it doesn't have such strict, abstract doctrines like Protestant Christianity. It doesn't have all of these problems that they are starting to have with Protestantism, and Therefore, they're thinking, okay, this is not a religion, right? So they are sort of falsely concluding
Right.
that Protestantism and everything that goes along with it, such as issues of faith and a creator God and so on and so forth, those sort of overlay to all religions everywhere. And because Buddhism doesn't have some of those characteristics, that must mean that Buddhism is not a religion. Now he goes further and says, because Buddhism is not a religion, according to people who say this sort of stuff, New Agey Westerner type of people who say this stuff, and also people from Asia sometimes as well, because of this, it is thought to be sort of amenable to science, to Western academic science, in a way that other traditions, other religions, other philosophies are not. And because of this sort of equivalency, which is false and which is not textually supported, there are lots of New Age self-help people out there, lots of meditators and meditation teachers, and also lots of Buddhists as well, who are jumping on this wagon and saying Buddhism is unique among religions in that it supports the scientific method. And he cites all these different meditators and teachers and even the Dalai Lama who are arguing this Buddhist exceptionalism theory. Buddhism is exceptional among religions because it doesn't have those characteristics of Protestantism and because it lines up with the core of science. Now, I agree with all this very much. I enjoyed this part of the book because this Buddhist modernism, which has been done by other scholars, has been well observed, and his thesis goes even one step further from Buddhist modernism to say, not only has it been modernized to a rational, secular, scientific society, such as the modern Western society we live in, it has also been taken one step further to be made into an exceptional case. It's been exceptionalized as well as modernized, to the point where, as he says, even in the first few pages of his introduction, you can look at a book that says Buddhist biology or why Buddhism is true and not even bat an eye.
Sure.
Whereas if you saw why Judaism is true or Christian biology, you would look at that and say, no, that doesn't even make any sense, right? Your reaction would be different. Sure. And so that's sort of his thesis for this chapter, and he explores that myth in his first chapter. So it's a very fascinating concept, and it's very well founded based on what I've seen, what I've read, and just broadly what I know about most people's relationship with Buddhism in the West.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, thank you for that. And again, thank you for outlining. We will be breaking this book up into different chapters just to kind of be able to get into more of the nitty-gritty kind of stuff going forward. But yeah, no, that was a great summary of his thesis, I think. And kind of as you were saying it, this is my second time reading the book now. As I'm going over it a second time, I'm reading all of my annotations, and, I think my biggest gripe with Thompson is kind of saying, well, not everyone's saying this. But actually, I think that it is a bit more of I won't say it's like a problem, like it's a, menace to society or something like that, but it's a far more widespread misconception, I think, than I had previously given myself permission to believe, in that I think this is how many people think about Buddhism, and I think it's something I hear a lot. Which it's fine however people want to relate to spirituality and religion and so on and so forth. But I've actually met a few people who will start talking about Buddhism just kind of in passing, and they'll say, "Oh, I'm Buddhist," and I'm like, "Huh, okay," and I'll dig a little further and just kind of ask them questions, not like judging them, just kind of trying to see where they stand with everything. And it turns out that, well, they don't really know any of the precepts, and they haven't taken the precepts, and they don't really know that much about the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, which is kind of the core foundational stuff that you see across any tradition of Buddhism. And it turns out maybe they just really like Buddhist art or how temples look, and that's totally fine. But to have this, idea that in and of itself makes them Buddhist, it just doesn't sit well with me intellectually. I'm not offended by it. It just seems confusing to me. So I do think this is a bit more of a misconception than I had thought the first time. And I really like that he's addressing it because, you do see this relationship to Buddhism proliferated throughout much of contemporary discussion and media and just even on YouTube. And again, while it's not, destroying society or something like that, I think it's definitely a big misconception that many people adhere to.
I agree completely. And it's unfortunate because, like you're saying, I don't have any personal issue with people who make the mistakes that he's saying that they're making in this chapter. I'm not saying that if somebody likes Buddhist stuff and they like mindfulness and stuff like that, that they are not allowed to be something. They can identify however they like, and as long as they're not hurting anybody, then that's all fine. And this issue of like religious identity is necessarily extremely complicated, especially in a postmodern world that we live in now, where people are responding to some very serious and very founded problems they have with Judeo-Christian religions, and they're moving toward other stuff. However, one thing that I would have liked to see, actually two things I would have liked to see Evan Thompson go a little bit further with in his diagnosis of this problem. The first is sticking more strongly to a definition of religion that he's going to use for the purposes of this book when he mentions what is and is not religion. It kind of stuck out to me in the introduction how he avoided a definition of religion and just kind of waved it away and said, scholars differentiate. They are in still a lot of debate about how to define religion. That's kind of like the greatest understatement of all time.
Sure. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the thing that is, whenever you go to graduate school for religious studies like I have, they want you, of course, to have education in theory and in a method. The theory will inform your perspective on how you're approaching these materials that you're going to study, and the method will give you the toolbox that you need to craft arguments and make examinations and come to conclusions and make interpretations of stuff that you do. And that's all very good that they do that. So they don't tell you in graduate school, here's a million different definitions, or here's a million different theories of religion. Pick one, and that's yours forever. It doesn't work that way. You don't have to like pick one and then stick with it. But they do present these to you in terms of degrees of usefulness. They say, here's 10 or 15 different definitions of religion that we can observe across the scholarship, going all the way back to like the 1800s. And there's these different ways that these have been used. Here's how useful these theories have been in the past, and here's how not useful they've been. Here's what they have captured, here's what they haven't captured. And so available to me as the religious scholar is not just one of the theories of religion that is the predominant one and the one we stick with forever. It's, it's going to be the entire repertoire of everything that's been written so far up to this point. And so that all sort of collectively defines how I understand religion, and that all is going to inform how I'm approaching religious stuff. And he's approaching religious stuff in this book, and he just sort of draws over it and says, no one can really, I'm not really going to say what the definition of religion is or what anyone else says it is. We're just going to move forward and just say that what is going on here is squarely religious and not scientific. I would have liked to see more of that. Another thing I would have liked to see more of is another issue that you're pointing to which is there is a fine line, which is deliberately blurred, by the way, between actual Buddhism and mindfulness capitalism. And I would have liked to see a little bit more of like of an examination of how mindfulness capitalism is sort of co-opting Buddhism, or you could call it New Age capitalism or self-help capitalism. Things like the Calm app on your phone and things like The Secret and all of these media franchises, which are essentially co-opting imagery and terminology from Buddhism, but they're not actually like really telling you anything about Buddhism. They're kind of taking things out of context and presenting them in such a way as to make you think that you can just pick and choose. You can just chop something up and whatever piece fits is the piece that fits and then throw away the rest. And in doing so, they're selling you something. They're selling you something based on this imagery and this terminology. And it's really like an industry. And it's founded on this assumption, which fits very well in with this Buddhist exceptionalism theory that Evan Thompson is posing. It's based on this assumption that you can do that to Asian religions, but you can't do that to Christian religions, Western religions. You can do that to Asian religions because they are on the other end of the colonial relationship, and they're on the other end of the post-colonial relationship. And so, yeah, that's totally fine. So they're taking these things like meditation and they're saying, here's the core of all Buddhism. Or they're even just taking things that they call mindfulness, which are not actually founded textually accurate forms of meditation at all. And they're saying, here's the core of Buddhism. Here's the core of Buddhist practice. But then again, if you go to a Christian and you say, prayer is the sole, core, essential practice and meaning and significance of Christianity all in one, then that's kind of an offensive statement because there's so much more to it. There's the Golden Rule, there's the 10 Commandments, there's going to church, there's all kinds of stuff. There's in Catholicism, there's the 7 sacraments. In Protestantism, there's converting people and witnessing their conversion and saving people. There's so much that is going on here that is squarely religious. But these things like the Calm app, The Secret, New Age self-help capitalism are sort of co-opting these bits and pieces like mindfulness of your breath. And they're saying, this is pretty much the whole thing. But I've read enough sutras and seen enough rituals and participated in enough rituals to know that there is so much more abstract, squarely religious stuff going on. And he correctly mentions that all of that ritual, all of that myth, all of that cosmology, all of the trippy stuff, all of the difficult stuff, all the stuff that gets sort of pushed to the side in a rational, materialist, scientific Western society exists in Buddhism. And I think that it's kind of a shame. I think it's a reflection of an echo, you might say, an echo of the colonial relationship between the West and Asia. They think that they can sort of just take from there, but they would not dare take from Judeo-Christian religions. And it would be very, very offensive and very bad if it worked the other way and they took from Judeo-Christian religions and did the same thing.
Sure. You mentioned something that I thought was kind of a key takeaway for me from this book. Of course now I'm forgetting it. I think you had mentioned, essentially what I see as the biggest takeaway for me personally from this thesis of Buddhist exceptionalism is kind of what you mentioned at the beginning of your last response. And I think you had basically mentioned, like, it's fine if people want to, do their own thing, but to understand is the important thing. And I think it was Alexander Mayer who told me this, or, maybe I just, you hear it a lot, but it's kind of this idea of know enough to break the rules, basically. In other words, know enough about the subject so that when you go against the subject or the teachings or the tradition or whatever it is, you know what you're doing. instead of kind of just like, yeah, I'll just kind of like take this and I'll say this is Buddhism and this isn't Buddhism, kind of pretty much just arbitrarily. And I think it's important because, Thompson does really love Buddhism. I think he even says that at one point he's very sympathetic to the goals of the Dalai Lama, politically, religiously, as it pertains to spreading Buddhism kind of as a force for, personal wellness to people who are interested. But he also very much values, to my mind, understanding the tradition on its own terms. And I can't find the quote right now, but essentially he says that by committing this error of Buddhist exceptionalism, specifically with regard to its relationship to science, it actually makes understanding Buddhism a lot less interesting. It really kind of just levels a lot of the nuance and, intra traditional philosophical debates over thousands of years, and kind of, the beauty and the mysticism and the ritual and everything that goes along with the religion of Buddhism. It gets obscured and very much simplified, and it's very disingenuous to my mind to, again, the reality and all of the beauty that Buddhism has to offer. Now, whether or not you choose to believe in that, that's your choice, obviously. But if we're going to talk about this thing called Buddhism and compare it to something else that we're calling science, we have to first understand, okay, well, this is what Buddhism is actually saying, and not just simplify it for the sake of making it more amenable in our own modern 21st century minds to the scientific method, which is historically far more recent than Buddhism is.
I agree completely. And I think that he correctly diagnoses that problem too, which is, they're not just misunderstanding Buddhism when they say this, they're also misunderstanding science. In one of my more recent courses with Professor Mayer, he brought up this idea that we had talked about or danced around before in other classes called scientism. And this is kind of a belief system in the West that it's not very popular. It's not very huge. It's not a majority. It's sort of like an extrapolation of, our scientific, rational-based Western thinking. The idea behind scientism is essentially that, yes, the scientific method and everything that our senses show us according to that method is capital T truth. And so therefore science can be looked at as the sole total arbiter of all truth about the universe, whereas religion is pure delusion and pure mistake and complete and utter failure of a person to acknowledge what is in front of their faces. And in our discussions, we said a couple of things. One of the first things I said, having come from a science background, with my biology studies in my undergraduate years, I said, nobody believes that in science. There are scientists, people who do science, but there are no scientists who adhere to or believe in this scientism. Scientism is a complete misunderstanding of what science and what it is about are actually doing. There's a core belief, or a core assumption, you might say, baked into modern Western academic science, which is that we're just doing our best with what we have. Our senses very much are incomplete, right? There's tons of wavelengths of radiation that do not register to our eyeballs as visual light. There's only 16 million colors we can see. And, with our instrumentation, for example, there's only so far we can zoom in on the microscope. There's only so far we can zoom in with the telescope. There's only so much. Our instruments are only so good. But replicating things in an experimental setting and minimizing confounding variables in an experimental setting and observing what happens and observing patterns and diagnosing patterns in the world, that's just the best way that we think we can get by. And in some ways, that's true. Medicine has sort of proven that, right? Western medicine keeps people alive for a lot longer than other types of medicine have in the past on the sort of grand average, right? Does it increase quality of life? That's a different question. It's not a scientific question. I think that quality of life is not really a part of quantity of life, but medicine can keep people alive for a very long time. So nobody thinks that, the Big Bang or evolution is this like staunchly immovable monolith that cannot be challenged by different evidence. They think like, as soon as I see evidence to the contrary to something, I will change my orientation, change my mind, adjust the theory, adjust what's going on, because all we're doing is just observing patterns. And our observation is limited, but it's the best we got. Scientism, which is, like I said, a very bad misunderstanding of all that stuff, is just this idea that no matter what happens, the Big Bang is it. And scientism thereby makes the mistake that they diagnose Christianity as making or other religions as making, which is, what's the difference between saying the Big Bang is it, that is the creation story of the universe, versus saying Adam and Eve is the creation story? There's no difference at all. So that's sort of very important in this misunderstanding, is that in saying Buddhism and science are amenable to each other, you have to flatten and misunderstand and sort of essentialize both, not just Buddhism, but also science.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You hit the head on the nail, I think. So let's get into some of the questions that I had sent you. This is the last question, I think, in the list, but I think it's good to bring it up here. So we were just talking about kind of this relationship between Buddhism and science, as Thompson analyzes. So he has this quote on page 41, and I thought it was pretty astute, and I wanted to get your take on this. So he says, ancient peoples didn't carve up the world into religious and non-religious spheres. So, and essentially he goes on to say that, this separating the two into, what we know today as religion and science, is a largely anachronistic move. And it's not necessarily incorrect, but it's historically very recent. So I was curious to know what you thought of this, and specifically kind of, with respect to what I'm trying to do at Vijñapti, of this merging of science and religion, and philosophy and so on. If you could kind of speak to, this, maybe this is a little grandiose, so, bear with me if it is, but I'm kind of curious if maybe this kind of endeavor represents somewhat of a return to, and other people who are interested in doing the same, if it represents somewhat of a return to an earlier conception of the world, in the sense that, this thing that we're calling science, this thing that we're calling philosophy over here, this thing that we've got going on called religion over there, well, they're not actually different from each other. They're different ways of looking at the same thing. Do you, as somebody who studies religion, do you agree with his assessment of how ancient people perceived all of these things?
I absolutely do. Yes, it's incredibly and very true that and he correctly mentions this as well, the word religion is an invented Latin word or invented, Western word that comes about in, the post 1600s era of history. And looking back further than that, or looking anywhere else besides Europe and, the United States, you won't find religion or such a concept anywhere. In the past or in Asia, Africa, all of these different places. You won't find it in North or South America before the Europeans get there. And you don't find it in Asia in particular until the 1800s when the Americans show up and the Europeans show up. So it's definitely a very new way of looking at the world, this idea of what is religion and what isn't. And it is correct to say also, for example, pre-modern Buddhists did not say, I am Buddhist. Isms did not necessarily have the same form or shape that they have in our modern lexicon. There's Christianity or Christianism, there's Judaism, there's Islam or Islamism in the modern world. These things don't really overlay onto history in any significant way. And that's true of so many things that are like the water for us, like the idea of a country and a state and a nation. None of that stuff fits either, right? And the further you go back in time and the further away you go from your own cultural background, the more you find that some of this stuff just does not serve you to observe what you're looking at. Now, he's correct in saying that religion is a prescriptive term as much as a descriptive term. So whenever you call something a religion to the people who are doing it, then they're going to live up to that definition, if that makes sense. Right? And so that's kind of what you observe happening with a lot of religions in Asia during the colonial period. However, the colonial relationship changes things. The colonial relationship causes them to say, wait, no, our religion is better than all other religions. In fact, it's a philosophy. It's a science. And here's the reasons why. And they start saying, because it doesn't have all the characteristics of this word religion. It has more of the characteristics of this word philosophy or this word science. And so definitely doesn't really, because of the sort of fraught power relationship in that conversation, you cannot ever really take it all for complete total accuracy. You have to take it all with a grain of salt, because that was a very tense, fraught, asymmetrical conversation going on between colonizers and people being colonized. So it's very complicated, and there's a lot of good material out there to read about how it went, but best not to read anything that happened there back onto history prior to the colonial encounter. And so on to the next part of your question. When you're talking about, essentially you're talking about consilience, or this idea of, looking at all of these different disciplines and methods in order to come to a more holistic view about a thing, be it consciousness or the origin of the universe or the nature of reality or the nature of the self, what have you. I think that consilience and looking at different methods and different disciplines, interdisciplinarity, I think that's all the very best way to sort of get a picture of what's going on in front of our eyes on a daily basis and what's going on beneath the surface. However, we have to also understand things in their own terms, and we have to be mindful of our own sort of arbitrary categories that we're putting onto the world, and thereby actually be more aligned with this idea of consilience than we might think. So when it comes to something like consciousness, or when it comes to something like the nature of self or the nature of reality and its substrate, if we want to look at it from a psychological, from a philosophical, from a religious, from a scientific perspective, or all of those perspectives at once, we have to know that the method that we have decided is attached to one or all of those, and sort of the results of that method, whenever you apply that method to a thing in reality, we have to know that all those categorizations are verging on arbitrary. Now, what I'm saying is, like, the methods are different, but
Sure.
categorizing the questions is completely arbitrary. You know, we say in science cannot and does not ask questions about the existence or lack thereof of a capital G Christian God. That's true. Science doesn't do that. But it's just an arbitrary decision not to, really. And the reason why is because it's been decided based on the method that you can't answer that question based on the tools that we currently have or have had since, you know, the Enlightenment era in the 1800s, when sort of the scientific method is born. It's not that it can't, it's just that it won't, and it can't right now, right? And so I guess what I'm saying is,
Sure.
if you're going to carve up questions or inquiries, you have to understand that carving them up it's going to be based on a specific set of cultural backgrounds and values, and those same questions were not cut up and carved up and categorized that same way in the past. There was no
Sure.
such distinction as a philosophical question or a scientific question or a religious question in the ancient past. And for us to do so now is fine and will yield us very interesting and different results based on which one you use. But we should know, if we are to be conciliant as thinkers and as scholars, that it is completely made up.
Sure. No, I'm glad you gave that assessment. Kind of this phrase I kept repeating in my head as you were saying that is, it is what it is, right? Whatever we call it, the thing stays the same.
Right.
One example that I thought of, you hear, so psychology, is very recent. The intellectual, scientific, psychotherapeutic traditions of psychology are, about 150 years old at most, depending on, who you want to look at. And something that you hear a lot, in media, kind of in history and like pop culture, is kind of this like diagnosing people from like 1,000 years ago, like trends. And, you'll hear maybe Joan of Arc, for example. You'll read about her, and I read this book by Michio Kaku, who is a physicist and a scientist, and he was kind of, doing this thing too, where he's like, Joan of Arc was a bipolar like girl from like 500 years ago who had like a number of seizures and, said all these things, and it's like, okay, maybe that, is one, potentially true in that, she could actually qualify for that diagnosis if she was alive today, like 500 years later, or, however long it's been. But also, whatever she said, whatever experiences that she had, they're still the same experiences. And one, they're not bad, right? That doesn't make her bad, even if she was, what we're calling today bipolar. But two, it's still the same thing. And to, again, as you're saying, if we want to do that, if we want to look to history and say, this person was a schizophrenic, this person had bipolar, this person was had depression, that's fine, but we need to understand that when we're saying that, it's pretty much completely arbitrary, because there is no way of knowing that exactly, and more importantly, that's just one way to talk about it. That's just one way to look at whatever it is that we're trying to look at, and it's not the only way. And we need to recognize at the same time that by doing that, we are imposing our own conception of things as modern people on a completely different historical epoch and using that anachronism to understand. And again, I'll keep repeating this. That's fine, but we need to be aware of the fact that we're doing it. Sorry. No, thank you. I very much appreciate that response, and keeping that in mind for anyone else who is equally interested in using consilience as kind of a tool to explore these questions of consciousness, mind, existence, self, what have you. I wanted to turn to, I think now it's let's see. So kind of going off of what you said, taking things on their own terms, I wanted to turn to the second question that I have, and I'll read the quote that I gave. So Thompson is talking about this guy, Vijñapti. He says, Vijñapti asserted that, this is a longer quote, so, bear with me, Nick. It's about a paragraph, so I'll just read through it and then,
of course, yeah,
turn it back to you. So he says, Vijñapti asserted that in the light of bare attention, the seemingly uniform active perception will, with increasing clarity, appear as a sequence of numerous and differentiated single phases, following each other in quick succession. This basic observation, he continued, will prove to be a truly scientific observation. So we'll leave that part out about, whether or not it's how scientific it is exactly, because we've been talking about that a lot. But how do we know that everyday active perception is really made up of a sequence of single phases as opposed to a continuous flow that gets turned into a sequence of short-lived phases as a result of practicing bare attention while sitting still deliberately or deliberately walking very slowly, and as one does in the practice of modern Theravada insight meditation? Does bare attention reveal the antecedent truth of no self, or does it change experience so that the experience comes to conform to the no self norm by leading us to disidentify with the mind so that it's no longer experienced as I, me, or mine? And he ends, is bare attention more like a light that reveals things, or a mold that shapes them? So he kind of posed that as hypothetical to, explore a point that he was trying to make in the first chapter. But I'm curious to take it on his own terms and kind of see if we can see what you think of this question. Specifically, is bare attention more like a light that reveals things, or a mold that shapes them? What do you see as the answer to that, kind of from your own background?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. Yeah, thank you for reading that out and for sending me that, because I definitely, when I read this, I was like, I want to talk about this on the show, because it's like it's sort of a hinging point. It's sort of a pivotal point in the entire argument that he's making in this chapter. So for a little bit of background, and Thompson goes into this as well, Vijñapti is the ordained name, or the monk name, of a Theravada Buddhist from the 20th century, but he was actually born in Germany. He's a German guy whose birth name, I believe, was mentioned in this book on page 30. His birth name is Sigmund Feniger, and he's somebody who found Buddhism later in his life. He wasn't born into Buddhism. He didn't get raised Buddhist. He wasn't part from a Buddhist culture, or a historically Buddhist culture, you might say. He sort of went to it of his own accord. And naturally, because he's doing this in the early 20th century, I so many problems with what he's up to. I think that there were definitely some colonial and some fraught misunderstandings that were happening between Vijñapti and Theravada Buddhism. And of course, he came to be a very highly respected monastic and a meditation teacher and things like that. And that's wonderful. But we should always be wary of people who aim to essentialize and give us the quick guide to what Buddhism is up to in the English language scholarship. I feel this exact same way, for example, about D.T. Suzuki, who does this with Zen Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism. He is somebody with an agenda who comes out and says, this is what Buddhism is all about. And basically, all you can glean from it is that this is what D.T. Suzuki wants me to think that Buddhism is all about. You can't make any sort of diagnosis about whether or not that's what Buddhism is all about. And I believe this is equally true here with Nyanaponika asserting that meditation can be understood as bare attention. This idea that basically you have freed yourself of all distractions and you have freed yourself of all emerging thoughts that would take you away, and you freed yourself of all of your cravings and attachments, and you're literally just looking at the world in this almost like Nishida Kitaro way of pure experience. Experience before discriminatory thinking, experience and perception before notions or conceptions are made up about stuff, before you make value judgments, etc., etc. Now, this is all true about Nyanaponika. This is all very shaky from the start. And because of that, while I like the point that Thompson is making in the end, I don't like that he pointed at Nyanaponika for it, because he's such a problematic figure, at least in the academic sense. He's not necessarily, I don't know if he's problematic in the sense of being a bad guy. I'm sure he was great, but in an academic sense, from a Buddhist studies point of view, what he's up to is sort of problematic. And so, as to this bare attention, I think that the point Thompson wants to make here is, whenever you do Buddhist meditation, does it really reveal to you these universal truths that the Buddha says that it does? These universal truths being the Dharma. So much of Buddhism and so much of the Buddha's teachings are hinged on this assumption that the Buddha didn't make any of this stuff up. He's simply perceiving this through his meditation and his practice, and he's just transmitting it to others so that they too can experience it, and then so they too can go and share the experience with others and lead them to it ad infinitum. His whole thing is, I'm not a prophet, I'm not getting divine revelations, I'm not related to God in any way or to some celestial being. I'm just a guy, and I did this, and you can do it too if you do these steps, X, Y, and Z. And then Thompson is interrogating that assumption, saying, if I do that, will I really learn about suffering, impermanence, and emptiness? Or does your method prescribe its own results? That is a very productive question. It's a very good, important question to ask. Does your method prescribe its own results? We should always ask that question of anything that we do, especially in an academic sense. When I'm studying religion in the way that I do for my living, does my method, my approach, prescribe its own results and its own interpretations, and thereby shut me out to any potential interpretations, any potential results that just don't fit? The answer is yes. Every single time, all the time, that's happening to some degree or the other. And that's why we talk about methods in terms of usefulness. You sort of pick what is the most useful means of interrogating the issue at hand, and thereby you get at least the most high quality results you can get, and you sort of filter out the noise. You filter out the most low quality noise that you can and hope that you get somewhere. Now, all of that works in an academic sense, but now he's asking this of a religion. And he's asking this of a religious person, Nyanaponika and Buddhism. I don't know that really makes the point that he wants it to make. Does Buddhist meditation inherently, freely lead to impermanence, emptiness, suffering, or does it shape our perspective according to those prescribed principles? In Buddhism, in Buddhist doctrine, the answer is that however you want to think, you will think. And that's why it's kind of A, a religion, and B, sometimes a little bit circular. If you meditate and you don't come to realizations of suffering or emptiness or impermanence, it's not that Buddhism is wrong, it's that your mind is wrong. And you have to keep working for however many Mahakalpas until you get it right. And you work on it by studying sutras and by practicing the precepts. And lo and behold, all those things are all Buddhist. So does Buddhism prescribe its own results from its own practice? Of course it does, because all religions do. If I pray and I speak to God on a daily basis, will I go to heaven? If you believe that hard enough, then I'm sure that you will. And that when you die, everybody will say that you went to heaven. And if you do that enough, so what I'm saying is what you're doing prescribes its own outcome. All religions are like that. Now, this probably factors more into his argument in the next chapter we'll talk about next time, which is, is Buddhism really true? Or why is Buddhism not true, so to speak? That's what that chapter and that topic are where I start to have a lot more issues with what Thompson is up to. And we'll get to that whenever we get to it. But I didn't like that he hinged himself on Nyanaponika, and I don't like that he asked this question the way that he did. Right after the end of that quote, he writes in the next paragraph something I highlighted to help answer this question for myself. He writes, "My point isn't that Buddhists can't come up to He writes, "My point isn't that Buddhists can't come up with answers to these questions. Rather, it's that simply appealing to the experience of bare attention won't answer them. The answers must come from the Buddhist mind doctrine, that is, from Buddhist philosophy, which is not just descriptive, but also inherently normative. Parentheses, it makes value judgments. And it's also soteriological. It's concerned with salvation and liberation. In other words, it's not the case that the experience of bare attention independently establishes the descriptive truth of the Buddhist mind doctrine. Rather, the Buddhist mind doctrine is needed to give meaning to the experience of bare attention." He sort of dismantles his own point when he says that. Mm-hmm. If he's trying to ask this question of, does it work or not? He's basically saying, well, it works if you think it works. And that's true, it does. So, to answer this question from a more personal standpoint, is bare attention a light that sheds light on things, or is it a mold that shapes them? For me, Buddhist meditation can equally be interpreted as a ritual practice. It's not a self-cultivation practice in every case. It's a ritual practice that you do as a practicing religious person, not just so that you can feel better about stuff. It absolutely works for that. It absolutely is very good for overcoming anxiety and sadness and pain and all these other things. But you can simultaneously look at it solely as a religious ritual practice, such as one of the 7 sacraments, such as these ascetic practices that Hindu practitioners do, such as only eating leaves and bark like Taoists do sometimes in history. Like it's a religious ritual practice. And that's all it has to be if you're going to practice Buddhism, the religion. That's all it has to be. It doesn't have to really make more sense than that, because Buddhism is a religion. And so religious rituals inside of a religion, they'll have their meaning and their significance doctrinally, but that doesn't mean the action itself has any meaning that you need to be interrogating or trying to understand outside of that. He's kind of, the reason why I highlighted this section is because he's kind of making a similar mistake to what he's saying Buddhist modernists and Buddhist exceptionalists are doing. Why do you think that you need to take meditation out of Buddhism and say, well, does it work? Does it not work? Is it true? Is it not true? That's not going to work. That's not productive. That's not adding anything to the conversation, because as I'm sure we'll discuss soon on this episode, if not soon in the next episode, meditation is not just one thing. Meditation is colored by your own mind, your own goals, your own situation, your own intentions, your own karmic situation, if we want to take it to a Buddhist place, your own sort of relationship to the Dharma and the Buddha and stuff like that. And so I just don't like how he's functioning off this assumption that bare attention works and that other things are just not really the conception. They're not really it, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, no, it does. It's kind of, I think what it points to, at least for me, is, he asks all these rhetorical questions like throughout his book, and it's like, does this actually blah blah blah? Does this really blah blah blah? And it's like, I kind of would have liked if he would have dived into that a little bit more, if anything, to kind of, support his point rhetorically that, we can take Buddhism on its own terms and take something meaningful from that, regardless of whether or not it's amenable to science in the first place, which it's not, because, the truths that it asserts are not falsifiable. They're not, privy to being explored through experiment and trial and error and independent peer review. They're just simply not questions that we can tackle with the tools that we have given to us in the scientific method. Nonetheless, these are extremely interesting questions to people who are interested in Buddhism. And I just would have liked to see more, I would have liked to see him at least try to answer some of his own questions, just because I think they are interesting questions. And I appreciate that response. And I think it kind of gets into the first question. It's kind of funny. We kind of circled from the last question to the first, how we did it. But I'll go to page 30 now, and he's talking about Nyanaponika again. But here he's more talking about mindfulness, and I won't read the whole quote here. It's about a paragraph, but he's basically introducing the topic of mindfulness here and kind of its historical origins. So I remember I had sent you this question, but I thought of this kind of right before the show, and it's kind of a weird question, but I feel like you're the guy most suited to answer it. So, we have this word called mindfulness, and it derives its roots from, ancient Sanskrit, as he points out here, and originally in the Satipatthana Sutra. Mm-hmm. And apparently so again, you can just read this in the book, but the original Sanskrit, the original Pali is Sati, and the original Sanskrit is Smriti, which essentially can be translated as recollection or memory or remembering. So there's that, right? And the idea is basically you remember in every moment your breath. You remember in every moment the inevitability of death. You remember in every moment the Dharma, whatever it is, right? And that's kind of Buddhist mindfulness meditation in the Buddhist sense, right? I'm curious to know, we have the Lotus Sutra, right? And throughout the Lotus Sutra, if I remember correctly, there is this recurring theme of like remembering. Remember the Lotus Sutra, remember something. And again, I could be wrong here, but I think that idea of like remembering and memory is kind of recurrent throughout the Lotus Sutra. And I'm kind of curious to know what you make of these two things, right? Like, is there any relationship, or am I maybe just seeing connection where there is none?
No, that's a good question. Thanks for passing that my way. I spent a lot of time thinking about this question when you sent it, because one of the issues that comes up so often in this topic of Buddhist modernism and mindfulness capitalism is almost always an issue of translation, an issue of the fact that the Sanskrit word does not have a one-to-one equivalent English word, and somebody made a choice which was limited in scope but was the least limited of all the choices available to them, or was otherwise biased by their own agendas and their own backgrounds. And now that serves as one of the pillars for how we talk about and understand Buddhism, not only in a common, colloquial, vernacular, everyday, common person sense, but also in an academic sense. A sort of horrible example of this is actually the word dukkha, which is suffering. Suffering is sort of a core doctrine in Buddhism. It's the first noble truth. Suffering exists. But suffering has so much more of this, it has so much more of this painful agony connotation than what the Buddha is necessarily always talking about. That's included in the scope of suffering, but suffering is also euphoria, and suffering is also happiness and stuff, because these things are all fleeting. That's sort of the core of dukkha, is that we have desires, and these desires are inherently insatiable, because the nature of reality is dukkha, is insatiability, is the inability for your desires to be fully satiated in a permanent way. And so that's a tangent, but it demonstrates the point that I'm going to make here with sati
Sure.
and smriti. So whenever you envision something in your mind, anybody envisioning anything, you are most likely remembering something. And that's just kind of how it works. So there are some people who can't actually come up with a mental image and see things in their mind's eye. That's like a real condition. It's been observed, and this sort of doesn't apply to them. They have memory, but they can't sort of pull up a JPEG file in their brain and look at it. For people who can do that, if you envision your mother's face, if you envision your favorite painting, if you envision a book you read, if you envision the food sushi, you are always creating that image based on your memory of something in the past. And so smriti is equally translatable as visualizing, memorizing or remembering, recalling, and also as sort of, you might say, holding it as the object of meditation in your mind whenever you're meditating on something. So when you are meditating on your breath, like in the Satipatthana Sutta, which, by the way, the Satipatthana Sutta is really described as the core of Buddhist meditation doctrine, when it's only one of many different sutras that concern meditation and this thing we call mindfulness. But anyways, when you see sati or smriti in that text, it's basically saying, remember your breath constantly. And by remembering it, what it means is you're holding it in your mind's eye. You are visualizing it as much as one can. There's no distinction between visualizing an image in your brain or remembering something you have seen in Buddhism. So whenever you're visualizing or you're remembering a concept or a thing, it's all the same. So if you're mindful of your breathing, from a Buddhist perspective, you're literally remembering that you are breathing, remembering the last time you breathed. This sort of issue, the issue that he's sort of coming up with, is that Nyanaponika is coining this term bare attention we've been talking about to communicate this sati or smriti to Western audiences, English-speaking audiences. And I wish that he had just sort of mentioned sort of the translation problem there. There's many different words which we can attach to smriti or sati, and the reason why is because that word itself is speaking to how we interpret and understand our own cognition of something we've seen, our own cognition of something we're doing or have done, our own cognition of something we've heard or learned in the past. That whole action of the brain, of the mind, was sort of collectively called sati or smriti in Pali and Sanskrit. So I definitely agree with how he's showing the memory part, but I wish he had shown a little bit more about how it's both memory and also holding in the mind's eye a concept or a thing or a person or an image or an idea. Now, connected to this issue of the Lotus Sutra, you are absolutely right that the Lotus Sutra calls upon the reader to do 5 things, the 5 practices of the Lotus Sutra. And I don't remember all 5 off the top of my head, but they are read, expound, embrace, propagate, etc. You're supposed to read it, you're supposed to recite it, you're supposed to believe it, you're supposed to spread it, and you're supposed to, worship it. And that sort of believing is sort of also similar to this remembering. Remember also, we've been talking about how religion is a modern word, and identity with religion is a modern phenomenon. In the past, there also was no real word for belief in that sense. There was a word for trust in East Asia, right, and South Asia. And, I guess there was also, you could say, a word for believing someone was telling you the truth in the moment about, you gave me $100 bill and here's your change. It's $25.17 back in change, believing them that they did the counting right, trusting that they did the counting right. But now, because of Christianity and Judeo-Christian religions, the word belief has so much baggage. And so when we translate the Lotus Sutra actions as believe and read and write and embrace and whatever, the believing part is so sticky. It would make so much more sense to, if you don't explain that issue in your own translation, to point at this issue of sati and smriti. The sutra is not calling on you to declare your faith in a Christian-style testimonial to the Lotus Sutra. It's asking you to just think about it a lot. And if you think about it a lot, then your life will necessarily be changed by it, because there is in Buddhism this inherent link between your behaviors and what you occupy your mind with. If you think about violence all the time, you're going to do violence. If you think about Buddha nature all the time, you're going to start seeing Buddha nature everywhere you see, everywhere you look. If you think about the teaching of the Lotus Sutra all the time, you're going to see the truth of the Lotus Sutra in the world around you. That's sort of another pattern of human cognition, is that the patterns that we see in the world are determined by the things that we think about and do on a daily basis in our own heads. It's sort of like a confirmation bias sort of situation, and that's necessary. It's a survival mechanism of the human brain for that to work that way and for it to be flexible. But you just sort of have to understand it's Buddhism, it's religion. They know that they're doing this, and that's okay. It's a religion. They're supposed to be doing this. If you think about the Buddha all day long, and you think about his characteristics and what he would do in a given situation, you're going to become one, because you're going to start doing that stuff. You're going to see it everywhere you look, and you're going to start acting that way. That's just sort of how it works. If you're repeatedly exposed to a thing, then you're going to be more like the thing over time. And you're going to think more like the thing over time. And you're going to behave more like the thing over time. And understand the world in terms of the thing more and more over time. And so the Lotus Sutra and meditation practice and things like that, they're all calling on you to just select deliberately, for Buddhist reasons, what you occupy your mind with, your cognition with, and therefore your life will change in a Buddhist way. And so that's sort of the answer to that previous question about, is the bare attention a light that sheds light on stuff, or is it a mold that makes it? It's both. He gives the answer to that question before he even asks it, because it is in Buddhism both. Your life and your behavior will be shaped by what you meditate on. But when you meditate, you're going to uncover things in the world around you that you weren't thinking about before. You're going to see emptiness in places that you didn't think that you would see it. You're going to understand impermanence in the context of way more things than you did before, if you think about impermanence all the time. And so, is it a light that sheds light on things that are already there, or does it prescribe what you see? In Buddhism, it literally does both. And so that's why I kind of had an issue with that binary before. And I think that a sustained analysis of this issue of sati and smriti would actually sort of preclude the need for asking that question later on in the text when he does.
Sure. No, thank you for that. It sounds like, and the stuff you're alluding to, we'll definitely talk about in later chapters when we start talking about, the idea of non-self juxtaposed with the Brahminical interpretation of there being an eternal self, and kind of what that means for Buddhism, as well as, it sounded a little bit like you were kind of alluding to the alaya vijnana, and
I was, yeah.
this notion, and kind of this notion of, the mind as being the faculty of cognition or perception itself, and then, getting into Yogacara, this doctrine of mind only, and kind of what that means for Buddhism's assessment of things when it comes to consciousness in the mind. I do appreciate you bringing up the issues of translation, because I think it's something that we take for granted. If you look at, I think Mayer kind of pointed this out in passing, but if you look at a text like the Vijñapti Matrata Sutra, it's essentially Mayer's English translation of 19th century French translation of the Japanese edition of the Chinese treatise on ancient Sanskrit text by Vasubandhu. And it's like, yeah, you're going to miss a lot of stuff there, like across all of those, linguistic and historical gaps that you cross in coming to whatever you're reading. So it's important. It's important because of the importance of language. I did want to kind of wrap up this episode. If you had any final thoughts on, this first chapter where we're pretty much focusing or tackling his main thesis of Buddhist exceptionalism, of Buddhist modernism, any final thoughts on that thesis?
So far, I just think that it's important. It's an important idea. And I think that a lot more people, especially people who identify as Buddhist and are from Western cultures, should read. I think that it's very much pointing at one of the types of water that we swim in that we're not aware of. Because how many people who have this identity with Buddhism from the West are even understanding or even aware of this colonial relationship and this post-colonial relationship that Western intelligentsia have with it? It's, hard to know. And so I think that this is definitely important and that it should be read and taught, because it's very well founded and it's very much observable in the world around us. And I'm excited to continue. I'm excited to get on to chapter 2 and beyond and continue sort of our conversation with each other and with Evan Thompson. I think that he's got some interesting things to say, and I think that our own expertise on my expertise on Buddhism and yours on how psychology is taught and practiced in this day and age, I think that'll offer some interesting insights on understanding issues such as, no self and mindfulness mania and other topics that he will go on to talk about in the future.
Sure. No, absolutely, Nick. And I'm looking forward to it as well. Thanks for having you on, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks. See you next time.